Hey, y'all. Welcome to the Liberation is Lit podcast, where the power of storytelling meets the force of social change. I'm your host, Taylor Simon, and in this podcast, we believe in the profound impact of stories. And I am super excited to have such great energy joining me today, author Cleyvis Natera. And we're going to talk about her new book, The Grand Paloma Resort. Hey, Cleyvis.
Hey Taylor, I'm so excited to be here with you. I'm just like falling all over myself. I'm so happy.
Oh my gosh, we've only been talking for a few minutes before recording, and just the energy in the room, like, it is so refreshing. So I'm so excited to be talking to you today. To kick us off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself as a writer and your journey to becoming an author?
Well, thank you so much, Taylor. I think for those of you who might not know about me, my name is Cleyvis, like Taylor said, and I was born in the Dominican Republic. I came to the United States when I was 10 years old, and I grew up in New York City. My journey as a writer started in middle school, I would say, because that's when I fell in love with reading. I had this teacher who just hated my guts. I was a little bit of a cloud, as you might sense from my big energy. And I was just not a pleasant child to have in a class because I was always trying to crack jokes. And, one of the things that she did in our class was that she said that anyone who read a book and did a presentation on the book could get 2 extra points toward their final grade. And I raised my hand and I was like, well, is there a limit to how many books we can read? And she kind of looked at me like, please, girl. And she was like, no limit. And I was like, oh, it's on now. So I just like methodically read every single book that was available. At the time, I was in bilingual education. So these were all books I was reading in Spanish. But somewhere between me just trying to prove to her that I could do it and that I could get a good grade, if all I had to do was read a book and talk about the book, I was like, I'm getting an A in this class. And by the end of that year, I did get an A, and I also fell in love with reading. I fell in love with books. And I would say that's really the first time when I realized the power of literature to like transport you and take you to a faraway place. And I just really loved this. So when I went to high school, I was in the newspaper and I started writing there. I was one of the editors. When I went to college, I started taking creative writing classes. And right after college, I went into my MFA program at NYU. And that's where I started writing novels.
Oh my gosh, just the life. And it's so funny. Everybody's always like, how do you get kids to read more? Apparently, just say, oh, you'll get extra points, then no limit to how many books you read. So I'm curious, how many books did you end up reading and presenting on?
Oh, yeah, I probably read like 30 books. Because like I said, I was not doing well in that class. So for me to get an A from like a C, I definitely had to have read like somewhere around 30 books. I think bribing children, and I'm a parent now, so I do recommend it. If you want a motivator, bribe the kids.
Yes, there's a bookstore in New Orleans, Baldwin and Co., where they give, I can't remember how much money it is, but they give kids like money for each book they read and book report they write on it. So, and they have the access to the account once they're 18. So if they want to go to college, buy a car, like they'll have like that money. And I think that's so awesome.
Well, I love Baldwin and Co. I'm actually going to stop there in August for my book tour. And I love that there. When I went there for my first book, Neruda on the Park, I just felt like I'm in another life. I must have been from New Orleans because I just love it there. The food is good. The people are amazing. It's always hot. That's like my temperature. So
Yes, I just went there like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and of course, I had to go by Baldwin and Co., and I had such an amazing time in New Orleans, and it's always associated with Black women for me, and I love that. So, to talk a little bit about your book coming up, what inspired you to write The Grand Paloma Hotel, and what message do you hope to send readers with this book?
yeah, I mean, I think the inspiration, first of all, came from me being trapped because I started writing this book during the pandemic. And during that time, the borders had been shut down. And, I was waiting to take my first book out to market. My agent and I had pretty much finished the editorial process, but because the pandemic has started, we couldn't take it out. I mean, as with every other industry, the publishing industry came to a complete halt. And so, at the time, my agent was like, you know what, let's just kind of put it on ice. Let's wait a little bit until people are reading and making deals. And so, during that time, one of my friends, Angie Cruz, who wrote Dominicana, she's an incredible writer. She solicited me. She was like, oh, she was a guest editor at the Kenyan Review, which I adore. And she was like, do you have a story? Like, we're just looking for something short, like 2,000 words. And I had been thinking about writing from the perspective of employees at a luxury resort for a long time. I mean, like I said, I'm from the Dominican Republic. I love to travel. So I've been to Bali, I've been to Singapore, I've been all over Europe, all over Latin America. I love the Caribbean. That's like my favorite place in the whole planet. And so over the years, as I had been traveling, I had noticed just like what an interesting and fascinating place a resort is, because you have this kind of collision of like these wealthy, privileged people. And what has been created is really a playground. I mean, it's like there's always some kind of barrier that separates the resort from the local communities. And then you have the workers who are usually local people, And so for me, I just over the years have noticed and have spoken to and interviewed people, both formally and informally, once I started writing this book. But I've just always had a fascination with like beautiful spaces and just exploring art in the framework of books. But I just love the idea of like thinking about class, thinking about privilege, thinking about local people versus foreigners. And so, yeah. So anyway, during the pandemic, I was just like, I want to write something that's delicious, that feels nonstop. I wanted to create an escape for myself. So I think that was the first point of inspiration, was that I really wanted to write a book that just felt like all these people are messed up. Like they're going to make terrible decisions. And I just wanted to write from that point of view, where like you have these women who are just, these two sisters, Elena and Laura, and they're just like desperate to get off of this resort. And I wanted to write also about like their friends at the resort. I wanted to write about, some of the guests that come to the resort. And so for me, like the point of inspiration was really like trying to buckle in and escape my own life and my confinement through like a really delicious and like nonstop set of characters and situations.
And it is nonstop for real. It's like from the first second, like, okay, we are off to the races. And so you kind of talked about like this book being a way of escape for you during the COVID lockdown. And I'm curious to know, and was thriller the genre you kind of settled on to tell this story?
Well, I mean, I have to tell you that I didn't intend to write a thriller. Like, I think, because I grew up as a writer, learning how to write, learning about writing conventions in an academic environment. I really grew up writing and reading literary fiction. And one of the things that always seemed to me to be contrary to my upbringing, especially being an Afro-Latina, being from the Caribbean, is that I mean, literary fiction, so much of what I love about it is the beautiful language and like the interiority of the characters. But to me, it always felt like it fell short of like my oral storytelling traditions. In my family, when people start telling a story, if you are whack and you're not doing a good job, somebody's going to take the story from you. Somebody's going to interrupt you. They're going to talk over you. If you're boring, nobody cares. Stop talking, And some of what I wanted to inject into my literary writing was really this kind of sense of propulsion, and like this sense of like tension. And so when I first started thinking about the resort and I started thinking about the situation that would lead people to not be able to stop reading, I knew that I wanted to be really around the compromises that people make. And so, Laura is like the older sister. She's had like this mother role for her younger sister because they lost their mother when they were very young. Laura was only 14 and her sister was 4. They have a 10-year age difference. And so for me, like when I was thinking about these two women, and I was like, you know what, if Elena, who's grown up with a lot of privilege, because she's grown up pretty much her whole childhood in this resort because her sister is a worker there and becomes a manager over time. then Elena's gonna have a very different sense of like freedom and like justice and the things she cares about. So I wanted to put these two women in conflict with each other. And so I know that the compromises that they would have to make in order to realize who they really are in life had to hinge on something really unforgivable. Like I wanted to make these women make a choice that a reader would be like, are you crazy? Like, did you really just do this? And so, when I started writing it, I should also say that like my first book, it took me like from the first sentence to publication 15 years. And I knew I did not want to do that with my second book. I was like, nobody's got time for another 15-year journey to book number 2. And so, when I started writing this book, I knew that I wanted it to be 7 days in a resort. Like, again, like I really was thinking structurally about escape and about vacation from life. And so the idea that like what ends up happening in this story is that, Elena injures a young child she's in charge of taking care of. Like, because of her negligence, this child's injured. And her sister decides to teach her a lesson. She's like, I want her to understand how serious it is, that she's going around doing ecstasy, going around acting crazy is not smart. And so her older sister decides to kind of like pretend that something more serious has happened than has actually happened to the tourist child, this white child. And what ends up happening over the course of like the next couple of days is that Elena actually ends up putting 2 real girls in real danger in order to like find money, and like she's very worried about her own freedom. And so it just kind of happened with the story that the mystery became a thriller. And, when I finished writing it, I remember talking to my editor, there was a switch in my editors, but I started out with Chelsea Johns, who's like an absolutely incredible editor. And she read the first full draft of it and she was like, this is like a thriller. And I was like, hold up. Like, I couldn't even believe it. I was like, this totally happened by accident. And, I've always really loved books that incorporate a lot of propulsion and tension, like romances, horror, thrillers. Like, I do have like a sense as a reader that those are the kinds of books that make you not want to put the book down. And so I just feel like because I've read so widely, some of those habits are just built in. And I also think that it aligns more with culturally where I come from, kind of stories my people want to hear.
I want to touch on that a little bit too, because I'm curious to, because earlier you talked about like the oral storytelling tradition and like how you can't, when you're telling a story, you can't be boring. Somebody's going to take the story from you. So how do you really incorporate a lot of like those like storytelling aspects that is rooted in cultural aspects and into your work?
I think the first thing that I am aware of, especially when I'm thinking about how do we inject our cultural roots into the work, is to think really holistically about what you want the story to do. I teach fiction now, so I spend a lot of time with my students talking about what is the feeling you want the reader to have. And so, for example, in my culture, Dominican people we all have big energy. Most of us have a sense of humor. We want people to like be entertained when we're telling stories. And so one of the things that I was thinking about as I was writing this is, Laura, who's the older sister, she's kind of an intense person. Like she's very like work focused. She's not fun, she's like a fascinating character, but I wouldn't want to go hang out with her and have a drink with her. So part of what I was thinking about as I was constructing this book was like, well, I know she and her younger sister are my protagonists, but I actually think it would be more entertaining to tell a story using a whole cast and to do it in a way where like, I am not a big fan of books that are told from a lot of different perspectives. They drive me a little crazy, because sometimes you just can't wait to get to like the real story, the real character you care about. But I was like, actually, if the story is the character, if the resort is actually the character of this book, the protagonist is a place, then the story would be most entertaining by following the people that make their way through that place and what this place has done to all of them. And so for me, like that was one of the intentional choices I made that I think is really reflective of my culture. is that, like I was saying before, if I'm telling a story to my aunts and, and I say something that's a little slow, I already know that my sister's going to come in and be like, that's not what happened, actually, and like, they're going to say something that's maybe a little more outrageous, maybe a little more exaggerated, maybe more hyperbolic, because it's like you want the story to be big. And so I was really listening to that impulse. I think that came from my childhood and like that came from growing up in like a tropical space. And I also wanted this book to have elements that like my protagonist don't have. Like I did want the book to have humor, even though it's not a funny book. I wanted like a reader to be reading some of this and be like, this is ridiculous. Like, what is this place, And so I just wanted it to be really entertaining and I wanted it to be like a fun read. Even if you are reading about situations that make you feel like, oh my God, my heart is racing, what's going to happen next?
Oh, yeah. And when I say it's a fun read, I had a couple of pop-up events. So Liberation is a pop-up bookstore, and I had a couple pop-up events at a bar last week. And that's where I was searching and I didn't care what was going on. I was in the book. I was in it. I was like, there's a lot of different people here now. Oh, well,
Taylor,
that's my book.
This is the biggest compliment I've gotten so far. Okay, the fact that you were at a bar reading this book, I did my job. I can resist it.
Yes. So speaking up to that, what are some things that keep you grounded in this work as an author?
Well, I mean, I think what I get grounded by is really part of like the question that you asked before, because we're having such a good time of forgetting to answer part of the question. I do think that like part of what keeps me grounded is what I want the reader to get from the book. And so, one of the things that I think about a lot in the portrayal of privilege in the Caribbean is that very often I feel like our stories are not represented. And even when you think about stories that do like a beautiful job portraying the setting, right? So like they really show how magnificent the Caribbean is. I think a lot of times like we don't get to be the protagonist, even when the stories are being told from our places of birth and like from the places where we're from. And so like part of what I wanted this book to do was to like introduce curiosity to my readers, whether they're Dominican people or they're, Americans, because, I'm a U.S. citizen. So whether they're from my, hometown here in the U.S. or they're from the Dominican Republic and global, I just want people to come to this book with a sense of curiosity and for the book to evoke in people a sense of what are the complexities that surround race in a place like the Dominican Republic? What are the complexities that surround gender? What does it mean to be a woman in the workplace and in certain places? I wanted this idea of freedom and how freedom is really a collective desire. So like, I really believe that we as people of the global majority, and I'm talking now about Black people in the world, like, I don't think that we will ever be free or liberated unless we are collectively seeking freedom. And so like, for me, and I know I'm like, oh, this book is so fun, let's go. But like, I also wanted to inspire in my readers that sense of, you know what, we are better than our worst mistake. And we are just as good as our community. We are going to grow when people love us. We are going to grow when people give us a chance to be our best selves. And that all of that is rooted in a knowledge of our history, in a knowledge of our collective liberation, and maybe even the idea that love of each other, made families, blood families, all of that is like an important aspect of what we should all be striving toward. So for me, that keeps me really grounded because I think it's really difficult to pull that off. To be like, I'm going to write a book that's a page turner, that's fun, that makes people a little horny at times. But then also that it's like about deep things that I care about, like history and race and privilege and class. Like, so for me, the ambition to do all these things in one book keeps me very grounded because it's hard to do.
Well, you make it look easy, honey, because I got all of that from the book. And I'm super excited for readers to get into it. Has there been anything that you've been reading lately that has been giving you life?
Yes, I just finished reading my friend Layla Motley's new book, The Girls Who Grew Big. Taylor, I don't know if you've read this book, but I feel like you and everyone you know needs to read this book.
Not yet, but I read Night Crawling, and I'd immediately that I think I already bought the audiobook. So I just have to I'm getting through my library of books first, and then I'm going to go to the ones that I bought. But yes, that is one I have purchased for myself.
Well, you have to get into it. And I mean, as a library girly, I do Libby, I do the physical books. There's a date by which you have to return. So I understand the prioritizing. But, Layla's new book is just astonishing. I mean, just like she did in Nightcrawling, where, we're thinking about the corruption of the police force and like how this young girl ends up getting caught up in like this prostitution ring. And the way that she has to grow up so fast, I think the girls who grew big does so much of what was working in that first book that was so brilliant, but I think it's so different. To me, like it showcases Layla's range. This is a multicast book. So you have three main protagonists you're following, and they're all young girls, young women who are, somewhere between being a teenager and then being in the early 20s. Two of them already have children, and one of them is pregnant, and it's a 16-year-old. And so, yeah, I just loved following these young women. Like there's Emery and Simone and Nadina. Like I'm never going to forget like what they're going through. And that story is really about the way that like the world can decide to dismiss you and that you aren't worth very much. But the way that you get your own self-worth is the people who are next to you, helping you to survive. And I just finished reading that book. The pub day was yesterday. And so I finished reading her book over the weekend because I really wanted to like write a post and on Instagram and like give her a lot of love. And I was just so glad that I like pushed all the other books out of the way to make room for it because it just gave me life. It gave me like such a sense of wonder, and it's just a beautiful story. Highly recommend.
Okay, so it might be time to push the other books out the way.
I think so. You won't regret it.
Yes. And so my last question for you is, what advice would you offer listeners who want to make a positive impact in their communities?
I think what I have learned in my own life is that sometimes when we want to make a big impact in the world, we think about these macro events or like macro, huge, big things that we need to do. And all I want to say is that like what we're living through these days is absolutely insanity. Our country is falling apart. All our rights are being stripped from us. If we're women, if we're people of color, immigrants are being kidnapped left and right. And so, when I think about like what people can do to make a difference in the world, to me is really going back to like your own community, looking at your neighbors, taking care of each other, offering people kindness, empathy, seeing each other as human beings. Because I don't think it's by mistake that we live in a country that is dead set on like, first of all, making us think we're not human beings. Second of all, stripping us of all our rights. And, and also dividing us. I think that there's just a lot of capital to be made by making us all feel separate and isolated and lonely. And so for me, like the biggest impact you can make is just to like reach across your backyard, reach across your neighborhoods, look at someone who like maybe has a different accent than you, that has a different background, and just reaffirm for them that they matter, that we all are worthy of dignity and respect. That's what I've been thinking a lot about lately. It's just like, how can I make an impact right here in my house, right here in my neighborhood, in my block? Like, how can I volunteer with like places and people that like maybe don't have the same ease of understanding the language or understanding processes, because we're all being disenfranchised, and whether it's affecting us today or later, believe me, like when they start stripping the rights of certain people in our community and in our country, eventually it's going to affect everybody.
Whew, I couldn't have said it better myself. So thank you so much, Cleyvis, for being on the podcast. Where can people find you and keep up with all your work and this book tour that's coming up?
Taylor, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you for having me. I loved being your guest. I would love for all your listeners to and viewers, because we're like to find me on Instagram is where I am the most active. So it's Cleyvis Natera on Instagram. If you want to come find me on book tour, my website has all the links and all the details. I'll be visiting 11 cities over the course of between August and September. And so I hope that people will just come find me. Cleyvisnatera.com is where all the information under the events tab, you can find me there. I really would love to meet everybody. And I really hope your listeners and your viewers will pick up my book. I worked so hard on it and I love it so much.
Yes, I will link the Instagram and website so y'all can get those tour dates and keep up with all the book news. And I will link how to buy Cleyvis's book in the show notes as well as her first book. So thank you again for being on the podcast. And thank you, listeners. If you have stories you want to share, want to suggest any topics, or just want to connect with us, you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at Liberation is Lit, or visit our website, liberationislit.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review. And remember, your voice matters. And together, through the lens of story, we're going to make a difference in the world. Until next time.